Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon on this beautifully sunny day. I know there's nowhere else I would rather be than right here for this session. So thank you very much for joining us. I'm Stevie. I'm the Head of Change for Policing and Youth Justice here at the Youth Endowment Fund, and I have the pleasure of chairing this virtual learning cafe. So today's session is focusing on diversion and how to do it effectively. And this is something that the Youth Endowment Fund are particularly interested in. I'm sure many on the call are familiar with the YEF, but for those of you who might not be, our mission is to not only find out what works, but also to help others to put that knowledge into practice. And diversion is one of those effective approaches that we would like to see used more widely. So I've just got a quick screenshot to show you from our toolkit. So our toolkit is available. You can find out so much more information, not only about diversion, but 29 other approaches. So I'd really encourage you to go and visit our website and click on the top right where you can access the toolkit. But what you'll be able to see from this screenshot is that we estimate that diversion is likely to have a moderate impact on preventing violence. And our confidence in this assessment is high, as you can see by the 4 magnifying glasses, which speaks to the quality of evidence that's available on this approach. However, we know that there's variation, not only in the way in which diversion is delivered, but also what children are diverted to. And that's why we've organised this virtual learning cafe today. We've got 4 incredible speakers who are going to be sharing their insights on how to do diversion effectively. So what will happen, each will present in turn, then we'll have time at the end for any questions and discussion. As I said at the beginning, please make use of the chat box. Introduce yourself, connect with others, and also post your questions. We'll be fielding them throughout the session. So without any further delay, I'm going to hand over to our first speaker, who is Kate Langley. She's the Director of Operations for the South of England at the Youth Justice Board. And most recently, she was involved in developing the case management guidance on out-of-court disposals from the YJB. So I'll hand over to you, Kate. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Stevie. Okay, you see my slides okay?
Yes, we can see them in presenter mode. So I don't know if you want to try again.
Bear with me, bear with me.
That's all right.
It's always the technical bit, isn't it? All right, I'm going to try again.
There we go. Yep, we can see it perfectly.
I lost my... Sorry, technical. Sorry, Stevie, keep talking for a moment because I've lost my presenter mode, I think.
That's absolutely fine. And if you have any issue, Kate, as I say, I've got the slides, so I could put them up as well, if that would be easier.
Yeah, it might be, Stevie, if you don't mind.
Yes, let me just get them. Everything becomes much more challenging when we're dealing with this heat. I tell you, if I had a Mr. Whippy right now, things would be flying. But, you know, I feel like the heat just adds an extra layer of tension to things. There we go, doing diversion.
Brilliant. Thank you. So I'll just give you...
You can start and I will present.
All right, brilliant. All right, thank you so much. Sorry about that little technical hitch. That's always where I let myself down, unfortunately, is on the technical aspect. But great to be here, and thank you for inviting me along, Stevie. So I'm going to kind of set the scene a little bit, I think, and just talk about why diversion is important and talk to you a little bit about some of the things the YJB are doing and the case management guidance on out-of-court disposals that was published in January. So next slide, please, Stevie. So I thought it was important to kind of kick us off, really, just to be clear what we're talking about when we talk about diversion, because I think one of the things we find is sometimes there is some differing definitions, but certainly when we talk about diversion, we are talking about sort of diversion where there is a linked offence and children receive an alternative outcome that doesn't result in them getting a criminal record. So it avoids escalation into the formal youth justice system. So we don't consider formal out-of-court disposals like youth cautions and youth conditional cautions to be diversion as they result in entry into the formal criminal justice system. And these definitions sit across all our kind of guidance documents. Next slide, please, Stevie. So just wanted to talk a little bit about the landscape around out-of-court disposals, kind of policy and strategy. So there have been significant changes to the out-of-court disposal landscape since about 2016 onwards. And kind of what's driving these changes is a real research consensus among Youth Justice Board, policing, CPS, and other key stakeholders that diverting children away from the formal criminal justice system has benefits for children, victims, and communities. And there's a strong evidence base around, why children shouldn't be unnecessarily criminalised. And that's kind of something that's really emerged and is quite consistent messaging kind of throughout strategy and policy. And there's a really strong consensus that children should be treated as children. So they are distinctly different to adults. And we see that reflected in the use of language, for example, in a move away from kind of youths, young offenders, towards using the term children. So just I'm going to touch in a minute a bit more about the child first principle and kind of where that's come from and how that kind of informs the work around diversion. But I just wanted to kind of reference our strategic plan, which we've recently published for 24 to 27, because it really kind of, I think, highlights our commitment to diversion and makes clear, we seek to support improved performance of youth justice services in the provision of diversion across the country. And we're committed to collaborating with partners across the youth justice system to enable increased diversion. An important part of that is about ensuring equitable outcomes and access to services for all children, including referrals through diversion. So, ensuring they're applied fairly and without prejudice to children from minority ethnic groups. But I'm going to touch on that in a minute as well. What we know from some of our research. So, for example, the research in 2021 on ethnic disproportionality in remand and sentencing, that showed reduced likelihood of Black, Asian and mixed ethnicity children receiving out-of-court disposals compared to white children, that couldn't be fully accounted for by differences in their demographic or offending profiles. And then obviously this fits into kind of like the national landscape around out-of-court disposals. So the kind of national strategy, which incorporates adults and the changes that's happening there. And the focus is very much on reducing offending and changing behaviours through early intervention, diversion and rehabilitative schemes that address the root causes of offending. Next slide, please, Stevie. So why diversion? I think really important to sort of have this in mind. It's very much evidence-based, and I'm going to talk about the evidence in a minute. But there is evidence that diversion reduces crime and therefore keeps communities safer, cutting cost and creating better outcomes for children and victims. So it is important that we divert children away from the formal youth justice system where appropriate. So there's strong evidence that diverting children who've committed low-level or first-time offences can protect them from future involvement in crime and violence. It can also lower the severity of any crimes they later commit. And we know that diverting children is also likely to achieve these results for a lower cost than processing through the formal justice system. We do recognise that diversion is not appropriate in all cases, and the serious nature of an offence, actual or potential harm means that absolutely in some cases formal criminal justice processes would be necessary. Next slide, please, Stevie. So there's just some links to some evidence in there. So, what is the evidence telling us? So I've touched on this already. But the evidence tells us that contact with the criminal justice system can lead to negative labelling and stigma, which makes it more likely that children will reoffend. There's evidence that, most children will naturally mature out of offending behaviour. So kind of what we do when they come into contact with the criminal justice system, has a real impact on their future. So the Edinburgh study of youth transitions and crimes, I think Claire's going to talk about this a little bit more. tells us that diversion from formal criminal justice proceedings mean children are less likely to offend in the future. And it really does highlight the importance of diversion as an approach. And also that the earlier we intervene to support children who are vulnerable, the more likely they are to go on and live constructive and positive lives. So as a result, diversion is also central to the child first evidence base. Next slide, please, Stevie. So I'm sure many of you will be familiar with the child first approach, but this is rooted in national and international research and contemporary analysis of the evidence. So it's a youth justice system that sees children as children, treats them fairly and helps them build on their strengths so they can make a positive contribution to society. So this is the vision that we seek to achieve, and the Youth Justice Board are committed to following an evidence-based approach. So, as I said, we draw on those decades of national and international evidence of what works in creating positive outcomes for children. So we've summarised all of this evidence as a child-first approach, and it provides the guiding principles for everything we do at the Youth Justice Board. And that includes our oversight of local youth justice services, data and analysis that we publish, and advice that we offer to ministers and partners throughout the system. So we do know that to create strategies around diversion, we really need to understand the reasons children become involved in crime. And we know pathways into crime can include societal relationship, community, and a number of individual factors. And we also know that it's a particularly complex and vulnerable cohort of children that come into contact with the criminal justice system, and that the youth justice system doesn't exist in a vacuum, and that socio-economic circumstances profoundly influence the lives and opportunities of children across the country. We know that many of the children who come into contact with the justice system are, for example, from our most deprived communities. We know the impact of the cost of living crisis and how that's created conditions where children are more likely to engage in violence, the impact of the pandemic, which continues to have, cause significant direct disruption to children's lives. So we know things like access to education and other services was disrupted for a protracted period. We know that there are challenges within public services when delivering youth justice, so budgetary pressures, etc. So, there's a number of challenges. So what we do in terms of diversion really does matter. Next slide, please, Stevie. So long-term trends are positive. So, just when I talk about these, we believe that the most trustworthy guide in uncertain times is to follow an evidence-based approach. So what are the data trends over time? So the past decade has seen extremely positive long-term trends across the youth justice system in England and Wales. So this includes substantial falls in the number of children entering the justice system. So we've seen a reduction of around 77% between the years ending March 2012 and March 2023. So significant reductions. And over the last 10 years, the proportion of first-time entrants to the youth justice system receiving youth cautions reduced from 80% in 2012 to 51% in 2022, which indicates an increase in diversion. So this is alongside, a number of other positive trends across the youth justice system. So a 65% reduction in proven offences committed by children in the last 10 years. The numbers of children sentenced at court being 73% lower than 10 years ago. And we've obviously seen significant reductions in the numbers of children in custody. And, greater focus by practitioners and policymakers, both within youth justice system and related fields, on preventing and diverting children away from the youth justice system are partly responsible for these trends. However, the number of FTEs to the youth justice system increased by 1%. So this is our annual statistics that we publish every year. So this is the latest publication, which looks at year end in 2022. So we saw an increase of 1% compared to the previous year, and that's the first year-on-year increase in the last 10 years. We've also seen an increase for the first time in 10 years of the number of 10 to 14-year-olds becoming first-time entrants. So we're seeing a slight trend towards younger children entering the system. And also, whilst there's been a downward trend in the number of child FTEs for each ethnicity over the last 10 years, child FTEs from a white ethnic background have fallen at the fastest rate, by 77%. Next slide, please, Stevie. So some really positive long-term trends, but we recognise that these gains can't be taken for granted. And the most recent statistics bear this out, with some slight increases in some measures from the previous years. So we've seen an increase in stop and searches. So there was an increase of stop and searches of children by 13%. A 9% increase in arrests. I've just mentioned the 1% increase in first-time entrants, 1% increase in the number of offences resulting in caution or court sentence, an increase in sentencing occasions by 8%. So whilst there's been some really, positive long-term trends, we can't be complacent, and there remain profound and entrenched challenges in the youth justice system. And we know that, again, the evidence base is really what needs to guide us in terms of, what's going to result in the best outcomes. Next slide, please, Stevie. So just wanted to touch on disproportionality. So we know that Black children continue to be overrepresented compared to the proportion of Black children in the 10 to 17 population, and that is across most stages of the youth justice system. So whilst we've seen the extent of overrepresentation reduce across several areas, including stop and search, arrests, youth cautions, and first-time entrants, we know that this continues to be one of our strategic priorities in terms of addressing the ethnic disparities, and it needs close partnership working. But diversion is a really important element of this, and that kind of importance of making sure that diversion schemes are accessible to everybody. Next slide, please. So what are we doing to improve practice? So, Stevie touched on this in the beginning in her introduction around kind of inconsistency. So we know that there is significant inconsistency across the system. So in 2021, we did a survey of youth justice caseloads, and we found an average of kind of 52% for England, and that was as high as 72% in Wales of caseloads was kind of prevention and diversion work. But there was substantial variation. So some reporting as high as 85% of their work, and the lowest as kind of 6%. So we know there's a real kind of disparity in the offer, although we know that there's been some positive changes kind of since this point. But we also know that there's a bit of a postcode lottery in terms of how out-of-court disposals are applied, and it's, real national variation in implementation and delivery. And that, diversion practice, varies quite significantly, and that can be around, for example, whether outcome 22 is being used, how different kind of out-of-court disposals are kind of being administered. And all of this kind of results in missed opportunities, really, to intervene and support children and ensure that they're not being unnecessarily criminalised. So we've done quite a lot of work around kind of trying to reduce that inconsistency, and a real focus on providing more comprehensive guidance on effective practice. So a number of the guidance documents, were out of date. For example, the gravity matrix, and that hadn't been reviewed or updated since 2013. And that was presenting some barriers to diversion. So that has now been reviewed. That was a kind of a 2-year piece of work. So that's been published, and a number of other guidance documents, which I'll just show you very briefly in a minute, in order to kind of bring all of that guidance together into the out-of-court disposal case management guidance, which I'll touch on in a minute. A real focus on kind of strengthening multi-agency partnerships, and also around improving monitoring. So there was kind of limited and varied national and local oversight. So there's some things that we've been doing in terms of, the MOJ published new key performance indicators, which have been implemented in April this year, and that will actually look at the total caseloads of youth justice services, which includes diversion schemes, so we can have a much better understanding of that cohort of children, kind of the impact and how out of court disposals are being used. And also really kind of wanting to strengthen how kind of local partnerships are gathering and analysing their own local data to, assess the effectiveness of their diversion schemes, how they're, measuring reoffending rates for diversion locally, whether they're gathering victim feedback from children and parents, do they really understand the cohort? How are they kind of using that data locally really to inform what they're doing, and that scrutiny arrangements are kind of really important in all of that. And it's all pulled together and covered in the out of court disposal case management guidance. Next slide, please, Stevie. I'm not going to go into this now, but I just wanted to kind of show you that, there's been a huge amount of work to update various guidance documents with partners, so that there's kind of a real consistency and a clarity of message across all of these guidance documents. And then, as I said, the out of court disposal case management guidance kind of seeks to kind of pull all of this together. Next slide, please, Stephen. So the standards for children in the youth justice system. So, they are set by the Secretary of State for Justice on the advice of the YJB, and they're intended to guide strategic and operational services understanding of what is expected, but they don't prescribe how services should be designed and delivered. So the YJB case management guidance is kind of the bit that sits underneath that, and it kind of details how those standards should be put into practice. So there is a big kind of redesign of those to ensure that they reflected current evidence, and that they were very much in line with the Child First guiding principles. And as part of that, in January, we published the out of court disposal section of the case management guidance. Next slide, please, Stevie. So I don't know if people have seen it, but I think it is, I do think it is a really helpful document, which kind of the aim of it, as I said, is really to provide much needed clarity on out of court disposal. So how and when to use them, a bit of a how-to guide on a range of developments to ensure effective delivery. And as I said, incorporates all those recently revised documents and brings them together to provide practical guidance on effective delivery of out of court disposals. So it looks at the options in detail for out of court disposals, formal and informal, and the differences between them, including deferred prosecution schemes where these are used. There's quite a lot on decision making. So who's responsible for decisions, how to embed the decision making arrangements, how you might convene your joint decision panels, what information you need to inform decisions, how to apply discretion, etc. And then lots of other useful things around eligibility criteria, assessments, interventions, etc. And quite a lot on who to engage with about your diversion offer and how to involve children and families, including really helping them to understand the implications and disclosure requirements, and also how victims should be involved in your diversion offer. And then there's kind of quite a bit in there around kind of scrutiny arrangements, because it is really important, whilst we're building a picture nationally in terms of the data around diversion, it's really important that there is kind of local scrutiny of diversion offers as well. Next slide, please, David. So I just wanted to kind of touch on some of the current activity that we're doing to reduce barriers and improve diversion. So, we're working with Home Office and MPCC to influence review of police counting rules and the police performance framework, and that is to address some of the current disincentives to the use of Outcome 22. I haven't gone into Outcome 22 in detail as part of this presentation, but obviously that is a particularly important diversion tool, and particularly in, kind of reducing overrepresentation, which I've kind of touched on. We still seeing that as an issue across the youth justice system. So it's a really important tool, and we're really keen that that is used more widely and more consistently. We're contributing to a further review of the child gravity matrix and some of the national guidance on knife offences, and really wanting to ensure there is clarity on the use of diversion for knife offences and motoring offences. So that work is in train. We're really keen to promote the understanding and use of the out of court disposal case management guidance, hence why it's great to be here today. So you know, I hope if you haven't seen it, you will access it and use it, and it really is designed to improve the delivery and scrutiny of out of court disposals. We've introduced a standardised assessment tool for prevention and diversion, which is for mandatory use by Youth Justice Services from April 24, and we hope that will improve the quality and consistency of assessments. We've contributed to the review of the child-centred policing strategy to ensure there's an evidence-based approach to the use of diversion, which leads to the best outcomes. Youth Justice Policy Unit are working to review the youth court benchmark, and that's about ensuring there is a nationally agreed process for sending cases back from court for consideration of an out of court disposal, because currently there isn't a nationally agreed process. I've kind of touched on data collection, so it is now mandatory that Youth Justice Services report on kind of diversion outcomes, so we can really gather a picture of what's happening. And also the new key performance indicators, which I touched on, will include all children supported through diversion intervention. So all of this will contribute to improving national data collection on diversion. Increased YJB monitoring of youth justice services, you know, and really, you know, us there providing support alongside services and partnerships to improve performance in the provision of diversion across the country, and to improve our understanding of how they're being used and how effective they are, and then continuing to collaborate with partners across the youth justice system to promote the framework of support and supervision. And that's really about enabling the increased use of diversion for children where appropriate. So next slide, please. This is just kind of bit of a sum up really from me. So diversion's effective and it's more widely available, but we do really need to ensure that it is fairly accessible for all children and disparity is reduced. And interventions need to consistently address the vulnerabilities of children and build on their strengths. Guidance has improved significantly and provides a clear framework for practice, but local partnerships need to consistently and rigorously apply the guidance in their local context. Data recording is improving, particularly at a national level, but data does need to be used locally and nationally to drive improvements. That's final slide. Next one, I think, just to say thank you. And I think there's any questions at the end.
Thank you so much, Kate. That was fantastic. So please do, if you've already made use of the chat box, if you've got any questions for Kate, feel free to post them there. We'll also take some questions at the end, but thank you very much. Right, now let's hear from Claire Ely. She is the Head of Criminal Justice Practice at the Centre for Justice Innovation. Thanks, over to you, Claire.
All right, can you see my slides okay?
Yes, we can.
Lovely. Okay. So yes, hi everyone, and thanks so much for inviting me to speak today. So just to tell you a quick bit about the Centre for Justice Innovation, we're a UK-based charity. We seek to put practitioners and evidence at the heart of justice reform, and we do that by supporting practitioners in the youth, criminal and family justice systems to sort of improve practice, but we also undertake our own research. And we do work with policymakers and officials too. Our current areas of focus are out-court disposal of resolutions, delivery both in youth and adult, and diversion. We do work in court reform, community sentences, and in family justice, the family drug and alcohol courts. But we're best known for our practice support to work with youth justice services and police forces to help them sort of implement and deliver diversion. We've been doing that for about 10 years. And we work closely with the YJB, NPCC and the YEF. So that's a little bit about us. So on to my next. So this is what I'm going to cover in my slide. So I know Kate sort of mentioned some of the work, some of the evidence base for diversion, but I think it's always useful to revisit that because I think we often do it at the beginning of our roles or at the beginning when we start to develop something and don't revisit it and make sure that any innovations or change we make are feeding back to that evidence base and what we know will work. We're then going to talk about effective practice principles of diversion, which are things we've learned over the years working with youth justice services, police and partners. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about our support offer. Oh, gone backwards. There we go. So just very quickly, I'll briefly talk about the age crime curve. So I know you will all be familiar with this. It's not going to be a surprise. But again, like I said, it's good to remind ourselves of the evidence. So most children engage in risky or illegal behaviour at some point. And most children are not apprehended after every poor decision, or but for some who might be unlucky, who aren't very good at it, or are stopped more by the police, will end up in contact with the justice system. But the vast majority of these children will not go on to become chronic offenders. And that language, chronic offenders, is not my own. That's from research. But what is clear is that most children do grow out of crime, and a first offence is not a particularly strong or reliable signal that a child is about to embark on a persistent and full sort of criminal career, and that even is the case for offences even as serious as robbery. So, slide, is that moving? There we go. So Kate also mentioned a bit about the Edinburgh study of youth transition. So this is a really great study, and I would recommend people, if they haven't come across it before, to read it. There's lots and lots of stuff that have come out of it. So that's a longitudinal programme of research on pathways into and out of offending for a cohort of around 4,000 children. And it's followed their sort of journey through their lives. And so some sort of key things that are relevant for today out of this study is that that the pathways of criminal conviction from childhood to early adulthood vary considerably, but it's those who are persistently in contact with the justice system over time tend to be those amongst the most poorest and most vulnerable, which I think won't be a surprise to most people on this call. And sort of finally, a key sort of finding of the study is that people who have come, and it speaks to what Kate was saying, people who have come into contact with the criminal justice system are not necessarily more likely to desist from offending. For some, it may act as a catalyst for continued offending into adulthood. So it's not the sort of only solution. So our analysis, we did a bit, it's quite crude analysis, but if the findings of the Edinburgh study held true for 100 English and Welsh children who turn 12 today, the following would happen. So there were 34 children would end up with a conviction by the time they're 35. 11 could be subject to a caution or a conviction, 11 of those 100 children. 7-ish would be likely to age out by young adulthood. And then there's a small group, so there's a 1.5, 1.5 children, may lead up to become sort of chronic offenders. And so what we mean by that in terms of research is that's defined by those who have the highest probability of being convicted overall, especially during their early 20s and into early middle age. So these aren't the ones who necessarily grow out of crime. But what the study also shows is that between the ages of 12 and 18, the children who are becoming those who will grow out at young adulthood and those who will become chronic look very similar, making it hard for police and youth justice practitioners to distinguish which child is on which trajectory. So you might think you know which children could be going on to be involved furthermore in the criminal justice system, but you could be writing them off too soon, and they might just simply grow out of crime. So it's not a reliable indication of that first offence, of that they're going to go on to do further offending. And then just to sort of add sort of further to the point, and again from what Kate was saying, is that the study also suggests that criminal conviction, especially when it happens repeatedly, will not change these trajectories, and if anything, it's likely to lead to them getting more, not less, enmeshed in the system. In addition, this study also suggests that activity in the early years to provide referral to substantive services such as youth work, community services, community activities, educational interventions can be a crucial factor in a child's desistance from crime. So again, if you think, well, we can't figure out which kids are going to be more likely to continue in the criminal justice system, so let's just target them all and hope that we prevent harm you're actually going to make things worse. So it's not a very good crime prevention strategy just to go hard on everyone and hope that you keep the communities safe and prevent offending that way. And this is just to sort of further my point, that formal justice system processing for children involved in low-level crime can actually make them more likely to commit crime, and it can extend their time in the system. And again, as Kate was saying, the research base is clear on this front. It's just not a couple of studies. It's not just Edinburgh study. There's an international research consensus supporting this. So in summary, what this sort of evidence and research tells us is that most children will grow out of crime. For those who don't, we can't tell who they might be, but we know the justice system can make things worse. But there is a better way, and that is diversion, which is a key tenet of Child First, as we've already heard, and it's an effective crime reduction strategy that will keep our children, their families, and the community safe. And it is cheaper than prosecution, so it's win-win. So let's talk a little bit about effective practice principles. So we have developed these over the years in a toolkit that we have produced. This is currently on its 6th edition, and it does a summary of the evidence, it does a summary of the sort of policy landscape, and then it does these sort of effective practice principles that you can use to help guide your practice when you're delivering diversion. They're produced in mind with the YJB guidance that Kate was mentioning, also stuff that YEF has produced, and also the NPCC. So it's not going to be at odds with any of those, and it's available on our website. I haven't got the time today to go through all the effective practice principles, so there's quite a lot. So I'm just going to talk you through these sort of core 4 overarching ones or rules. And again, the sort of findings, not findings, but like tips from this come from research, also from the practitioners that we've worked with over the year. So the first thing you need to make sure your scheme does is it minimises labelling. So youth diversion schemes should take all reasonable steps to avoid stigmatising the children they work with and to prevent them from forming deviant or delinquent identities that may interfere with their development. So labelling theory has been central to the rationale of youth diversion for decades. By reducing children's exposure to the formal justice system, youth diversion lessens the negative impact of labelling. So what does that mean for you as a sort of practitioner? So for policing, that means using arrest and police custody sparingly and only for those that you really need to, as it can be an incredibly traumatic experience for children. And that there's some brilliant research that's just been done by Vicky Kemp and Miranda Bevan around this that I highly suggest people read. And also within our work, looking at special educational needs, disabilities and neurodiversity and accessing youth diversion, children sort of shared with us their experiences of arrest, especially those with autism or ADHD, and how much that has affected them. And also, where you can, please use voluntary interviews wherever possible. We know some areas don't do the interviews at the police station either, which I think is also a brilliant thing. You know, we're talking about low level, often first time entrants. You don't need to put the full force of the law and the experience on them at this point. You will still get good outcomes if you take a slightly kinder, more humane approach with these children. And for youth justice services, again, follows all the stuff Kate was saying about Child First, but it's really important about your language that you use, because it's really easy to slip into criminal justice jargon, and some of the terms that we use are very negative. The location of where the service is, it doesn't have to be at the Youth Justice Service office. I know lots of youth justice professionals do them in children's homes or in youth clubs or in parks, things like that. If you're truly keeping this out of the system, that's a good way to do it. And then in terms of caseloads, having a non-statutory and statutory cases as separate as possible. And then again, if we're looking even further ahead in terms of minimising labelling, using outcomes that aren't out of court resolutions or disposals like CR, like community resolutions and outcome 22, will have a much more positive effect on people's criminal records and their future employment opportunities, because there's still a complete lack of understanding actually about the impact of an out-court resolution on a child's record, and it doesn't go when it's 18. It will prevent them joining the police. It might prevent them from doing other things. So you could stop a child's career really quite early on if you give them an inappropriate outcome. So number 2 of the effective our 4 rules is avoid net widening. So ensure that the scheme operates as an alternative to the formal justice system rather than as a supplement to it. Diversion should only be for children who would otherwise be dealt with formally in the criminal justice system. So a crime has had to have occurred. A child has to be linked to that offence and meet that threshold. And that's only them should be eligible for your scheme. There has to be a clear distinction between prevention and diversion, which there's a really good definitions that have been pulled together by the YJB that you can find. But you don't want to be drawing in kids that are suspected of crime or you think are at risk of getting involved in behaviours. It's not the appropriate venue for this. There are other ways to do that, which I haven't got time to get into today, but I'm sure you all know about the great prevention work that happens in your sort of local areas. But if you net widen, you are increasing their risk of future reoffending. Number 3, do not overdose children. So here we're talking about sort of programming that's offered, but also timeliness here as well. So for most children that go through diversion, it should be therapeutic and targeted, the interventions or support, and it should be light touch and informal. So in terms of timeliness, our sort of research and work we've done over the years suggests that diversion should happen as soon as possible after the arrest occurs or the voluntary interview or whatever it might be. Speed of referral is really important, and we suggest that's about 2 weeks at the most for children, because having too long of a gap between when the behaviour happened and when you're doing the intervention means it might not have the same impact, and children can struggle to link it back to that initial reason why they're there. And also, it's not great for the victims or those who've been harmed that they're waiting for ages. So it's not good for anyone. It should not last. So whatever you do with the child, whatever it might be, you should not last longer than a statutory order. We're not seeing that as much as we used to, but we did used to see a lot of children being kept on for a very long time as part of a diversion, which came from a good place. People wanted to make sure that they could, especially children who didn't have any other support network, but the criminal justice system is not the right place for them. If you can get them out as soon as you can. And some children may need no intervention at all, which I know sometimes people are like, what? They're in the criminal justice system. But they might have just made one mistake that they will learn from and won't come back. And you don't need to justify this by adding on an intervention that isn't appropriate or isn't going to make an impact. You could make things worse, or you're just wasting everyone's time and money. And it's about, I guess, as a practitioner, being confident and justifying your decision, especially within those joint decision-making panels where you feel like there's enough support for that child that we don't need to intervene at this stage. It won't be for all children, but it's something that you should always consider. And in terms of the actual work that you then do with the child, the plan should be co-produced with the families and the children, which again, I'm sure you guys all know. The focus should be on skills building, education, not control and punishment. You can see the toolkit and the YJB resource hub for lots of stuff, and I'm sure Misha and Hannah will have lots of stuff that they can share about that too. There's still sort of a bit of a lack of research about the interventions and the impact they have. Stevie mentioned that at the beginning. It's still an area that we could do better at. And there is a new mapping project that YEF have commissioned that should have some findings early next year that might shine a bit more of a light on that. And then finally, the sort of point around overdosing is we hear it a lot that people get lots of professionals coming into their lives and wanting to help them, and it's not always that's helpful having too many. So if the young person or the child already has a trusted adult and professional in their lives, they can undertake the interventions and the support of that child. You don't need to add a new stranger into their lives, so if you can avoid it. And then finally, our sort of final rule is around guarding against disparities. So access to and engagement with youth diversion schemes should be facilitated in a way that ensures all those suitable can avail themselves of its benefits. Diversion should help address these disparities rather than exacerbate them. So in our work, we've seen a number of points in the process of diversion where these disparities occur, particularly around eligibility. So some things you can consider when you're reviewing your eligibility or setting it up. Are there offence types or number of convictions that will prevent a child entering your scheme? Because you could be there unfairly preventing some children from accessing. And a good example of that is a scheme that we work with had a rule where if you had 2 possessions of cannabis, you couldn't enter the scheme again, and you ended up with an out-court resolution. When we know that area in particular, the children that will stop and search more regularly were Black children. So you are unfairly banning them from your scheme. So you need to look at that. You need to think about your admissions, like, are you asking for full admission, no admissions, acceptance of responsibility, and what do each of those things mean? Because we know there are a number of reasons why a child might not want to admit guilt. It could be that they don't understand what's happening to them, and that's just because the legal system is very complicated. It could be that they're scared. It could be that they have special educational needs and disabilities or neurodiversity. It could be they're scared of reprisals from whoever they've been involved with, and there could be some issues there around them being exploited. They could be protecting friends. They could have received poor legal advice, or they are innocent. You know, there's a number of reasons. So make sure you fully understand those individually for each child. Also, are you asking the children to not only admit, but also show remorse? Because we see this quite a lot. It's not a legal requirement of children to show remorse to get access to diversion or out-of-court resolutions. It also doesn't mean they're more risky if they don't show the remorse that you want. And also, what is remorse? What do you want to see? What behaviour, what words are you looking for? They're very subjective. And you could be excluding children who don't trust the system or those who have special educational needs and disabilities. Now, if we look at sort of assessment and disparities, where we see some of this is where we're trying to, and this kind of comes back down to the remorse bit, I suppose, a little bit as well, is trying to assess motivation to change of a child in a short assessment interview is a bit of a hiding to nothing. You know, people's motivation changes from 1 minute to the next. And then just doing it within that short assessment is not going to give you the answer that you want. Also around when undertaking assessments, practitioners' perceptions of family engagement. So a number of professionals were open about their perceptions at children and young people. So this was in some research we did around disparity and diversion. But young people from Gypsy, Roma, traveller backgrounds would not be supported in engaging with diversion, saying the reality is their loyalty to their values and their family traditions will always prevent them from accepting the opportunities they are being offered to them, which is a very sweeping, judgmental, actually quite racist statement to make there. And we should not have schemes that bar children because of where they're from or the communities they grow up in or their religion or whatever it might be. But we also see it in a less stark way, more kind of less obvious, I guess, is about families that don't trust the system or maybe don't engage with professionals as we would like. They're not a sort of normal family, they're not set up like we would like, or they don't parent their children like we would like to, being used as a reason not to allow a child on diversion. So what's some tips we've got for working on that? Know and understand your local demographics and how they match nationally. And I'm not just saying here your ethnic sort of breakdowns, it's also the needs and the health outcomes locally and nationally. You need to train your staff, police and youth justice services and partners on what community resolutions and outcome 22 and out-of-court resolutions disposals are and how you get them, what admissions you need. Train everyone, because I have not yet met one practitioner who can tell me exactly what all of those mean without there being some misunderstanding. It's really complicated, especially outcome 22, and it causes a lot of issues in terms of when you're trying to look at the eligibility for your children. You need to train and inform your local solicitors. They will be a key partner in ensuring that children have access. And if you're lucky enough to have a speech and language therapist, include them in your assessments for diversion and at your joint decision-making panels, because they're invaluable in terms of getting those children who need additional support through. And also invite your police to any training that you do around special educational needs or neurodiversity, because they don't get training as officers. And if they're a youth justice officer and you're expecting them to work with these children, I would suggest inviting them along so they get to have that training as well. I've then got lots of other tips around intervention planning that we've seen, and how you should do your data collection, particularly when we're looking at those rolled back from court. But I don't have the sort of time for that today, so I've just picked up the sort of key ones. But if you have any more questions about some of these that I've gone through, about our sort of effective practice principles and things that we can do to address this and make sure that your scheme is evidence-based and effective for all the children that it works with, please just let me know and get in touch, or put the question in the chat. So just to finish, I've mentioned it briefly, we have a support offer. We've been doing it for sort of 10 years. It's free. You can contact me if you're interested. Hopefully Kate can give me a good review. So we worked with her and her youth justice services a long time ago. And yeah, so if you are interested, do let me know. And all our sort of research and best practice work is all available on our website, so you can have a look at it all there. Thank you, Stevie.
Thank you so much, Claire. Such useful insights. Thank you very, very much. So just handing over to our last but not least speakers. We are joined today by Hannah Blower, who is a Senior Manager for Lancashire Child and Youth Justice Service, and Misha Aspinall, also Project Manager from Lancashire Child and Youth Justice Service. So I'm going to hand over to those for the last presentation. Please do keep posting your comments and questions, and we will take them at the end. Thank you.
Thanks, Stevie. I've already made my first technical error because I said to Misha, can you share the slides? And I've just done it. So I can see her looking at me like, what are you doing? Anyway, so just to share with you really our journey around introducing diversion into Lancashire. Important for us to say really, this isn't the finished article for us. We're a learning organisation. There's lots of work for us to continue to do, and our plan captures a lot of that for next year, particularly around looking at things like outcome 22 opportunities. We're going to do a communication strategy around our diversion offer, so that we're capturing things like our vast police force, our defence solicitors, CPS legal advisors, other services that need to know about the offer that we've got to then be able to support children in the most far-reaching way. But we did say that we'd share sort of our journey really in terms of how we introduced diversion, the evidence base that we captured, and our next steps really around that. So I can move my slide. Oh, it's not letting me move, Misha. And one sec. That's why. Right, sorry. So we launched on the 1st of October 2019, so quite a while ago now. We previously commissioned sort of pre-caution work out to a third sector organisation, agreed across a pan-Lancashire basis with our neighbours on either side of our local authority, and also our police force, that we're going to bring that service in-house. So we started a lot of work around the evidence base. So we were designing a service which really gave us the best possible reach for children, but was guided by the evidence. So that was a really important part of our development, and we've talked about some of that already. But we also looked at the Edinburgh Study of Youth Trajectories. We were looking particularly at things like system contact. So Claire shared some of that in her slides around sort of that impact of system contact on children, that understanding of children growing out of crime, and the best possible approaches to supporting children to exit the system at the earliest possible opportunity. So we made a lot of use of Macara and McVie's work around that. Steve Case and Kevin Haynes, all their work around positive youth justice and the child first agenda. We started to look at that really quite early on, and I know that obviously it's really gathered pace, a lot of that work, but we really tried to tap into that evidence quite early on around how that would support our design from an evidence-based perspective. And then we looked at Centre for Justice Innovation. So Claire's service supported us with some of those early thoughts around things like net widening. So I'm not going to go into that, but it was just around the importance for us around when we set up a service that it was guided by the evidence. And if anyone's ever seen Des Holmes speak from research and practice, she will bang that drum more loudly than any of us. And the passion that she talks about evidence is something that we really wanted to bring into the design of our service. So just share with you the next step. So when we thought about that, when we thought about designing our diversion service, we really thought about those children that come to the attention of diversion in Lancashire. For a lot of those children, it's their first knock on the door of our service. So we had to man that front door properly. So in terms of thinking alongside our children's services colleagues, when children come into your front door there, for some of those children that come into your MASH or whatever your front door looks like in your local authority, for some of those children, we're looking at the need to go straight into, you know, a child and family assessment or maybe a child protection inquiry because there's that level of concern. However, you wouldn't always jump straight into that. You'd think about what other early help services might be out there, what other support, what community-based support might be available to support this family. So when we started to design our service, we talked about it being a front door and we had to man that properly, so that when children were referred into diversion, we weren't hopping straight always towards that full-blown diversion program, because actually it might be that we need to do other early help things first, and that might be a better outcome because the evidence tells us that it might be a better outcome. So with that in mind, we talked about a continuum of need, which again is children's services language in a lot of respects around that sort of stepped approach to supporting children and families. And we talked about, you know, when children get referred into us for diversion, they might not always need the full-blown diversion program with us. So we talked about a universal support offer, which sits more our police officers in the community delivering a community resolution or outcome 22 or whatever that outcome may be. And as Claire said, some children don't need anything more than that. So that's sort of what we describe as our universal support. And then universal plus support is where children come to the attention of the police, but they don't have to come into our service. So that's when police have in Lancashire the opportunity to refer into a range of different community-based support services. So we're not doing nothing, but we're saying they might not need that specialist youth justice support. The next step up from that would be targeted support. So that's when children are referred into our service and we then do a screening exercise. And Misha's going to talk a bit more about what that screening talks about and looks at. But the key purpose of that screening exercise is to think about which of these children need specialist youth justice support, and actually which children and families really need that plugging into their community through third sector organisations, through our early help colleagues in Lancashire, through perhaps there's unmet family need that children's social care might be better addressing, substance misuse services, etc. In which case we'd be then diverting those services out of our child and youth justice service and into those other support services that could help them. But for those children where the screening outcome is they need specialist support, then we will obviously offer that additional support through an assessment and a co-produced plan. So it's really a continuum of offer that we've got, that some of it sits with us as that right-hand side, but what we've done is we've galvanised a partnership to be able to offer support at that lower end of that continuum of need as well for those children. So what that looks like from a practical perspective, previously when children got referred into our service, we had this pathway on the right hand side. So lots of our youth justice colleagues on the call will be familiar with sort of joint decision making processes, joint decision making panels. It's quite small, I'm sorry, but we can send the slides out. But this is what we previously had when children came into our service. So all children would go through to that joint decision making panel, we'd do an assessment, we'd make a recommendation to the panel, and then they could get a range of outcomes from that panel. What we introduced with diversion was the fact that our police officers, in particular our CYJS police officers, are really skilled at making those decisions about the right outcome for children. So police officers in the community can make a decision to offer an outcome 22 or a community resolution, or they could refer into us, and our police officers in-house can also make that decision to divert. We don't necessarily have to push every child into a joint decision-making forum. If our police officer thinks actually we can divert this child, it prevents delay and it helps us get moved quicker. So in that case, they take this left-hand side pathway. When we start the screening process, we contact any victims or any harmed persons as part of that process to make sure that their views are part of our consideration and their support is provided as well. And then we look at a pathway to either divert to other services or to come into our service, like that far right hand part of the continuum of need that I've shared with you. And what it gave us, this process, was several opportunities to divert children. So they could be diverted by Lancashire Police Constabularies on the constabulary colleagues, on the street. They could be diverted by our police officer if they get referred into our service, or equally if they go to our joint decision making panel, which is usually where they've met that caution, youth conditional caution threshold, we can still offer diversion there if following an assessment and a plan we think that that's the right outcome for that child. So it's given us an opportunity to have several different bites of that cherry, and that's really important for us as a service because we're a big authority, so the numbers of children can be very high if we put them all into the panel joint decision making process, and like I say, it can build in some delay there as well. I'm going to hand over to Misha because she's going to talk through a little bit around how we developed sort of that understanding with partners about the best offer for support for children.
Thanks, Hannah. Hope everyone can hear me. So I think when we were looking at sort of the value of partners, as Hannah said, because we're a very large local authority, we wanted to make sure that we are the right service at the right time for the children that we're working with and their families. So we have specific services that we refer into that do cover the whole of the county, and it's not that postcode lottery for our children as well, and they all have access to these services, which is really, really important for us. And I suppose recognising that as much as youth justice service staff are experts in that field, that actually we're not always the right service for those children and young people, and other services are better placed sometimes to offer that support, because we don't want to net widen and we want to make sure they're not brought in unnecessarily. So there are just a couple of examples of the partners that we do work with on diversion. So obviously our children's social care colleagues, if actually our child and family wellbeing service are better placed to offer that support and they don't need specific youth justice service input. It might be that it's purely sort of substance misuse is the reason that this child keeps coming into contact with the police, and therefore, again, as much as we have seconded workers in our service, it might just be that that service by itself is enough for that particular child. We also have the Champions programme that's listed there. So they are a community-based offer in our community football trusts. So 9 community football trusts we have across the county. As Hannah said, we're very big. So all of those football trusts are on board, and we have mentors in each of those trusts that we can refer children to if they just need that sort of plug back into the community and that activity-based mentoring support rather than that youth justice service input. And then similar with Active Lancashire, our colleagues that deliver sport and mentor-based interventions for our children and young people. If you go to the next slide, Hannah. So in terms of our screening, I did just see a question pop up in the chat of who completes those screenings, so I can touch on that. So it's our child and youth justice workers that complete that screening, and what they do is they have access to a range of platforms where they do an information gathering exercise. So they will meet with the child and their family, they'll look at our children's social care records, they'll speak to our seconded police officers and get information from their systems of, I don't know if there's been sort of multiple no further actions and things like that. So they'll also look at health, education. So they collate all of that information. They then make a judgment of what they would recommend for that child, but then it does come to a multi-agency meeting with a team manager, a CYJS police officer, and then a member of Lancashire Constabulary, or the referrer, whoever that may be, and they'll make a decision on what support that child needs and who is best placed to deliver it, which might not always be us as a service. And yeah, I've just got a point there about our assessment that we had previously used that has had that recognition, but obviously now, Kate, we are using the new.
We can't dine out on that anymore because there's a youth justice board national tool, which is great, I think, for services, but also for us because it means it can be part of our system and we can pull data better than we've been able to pull data before for diversion. Sorry, Mish.
All right, I was quick to mute in case everyone had a very horrible echo because me and Hannah are in the same room. So yeah, if you want to hop on to the next slide, Hannah. So yeah, just to touch on our data, as Hannah said, we are a very big local authority, so I'm sure these numbers will be a lot larger than some people be used to. So since October 2019, we've had 452 children that we've supported on a community resolution that have had CYJS intervention. So that is the number of children that we've completed that screening and then they've received support from our service. And we've looked at sort of numbers. We then track children for either 2 years or up until they turn 18, just to see if there's any further reoffending. And at the minute, that's 109 of those children, so around 24%. But we've also identified other better place services for 114 children. So they were diverted to other services, and of those, 21. So a similar percent, 21% have committed a further offence. So for us, we feel like that is encouraging and sort of backs up what Claire has said, that actually there's not much disparity between those figures, especially considering the proportion are brought into our service. And actually alternative diversionary support is just as good for those children. It was the right service that they should have been diverted into at that time. I have popped a note at the bottom because we are undertaking a piece of work at the minute just to relook at our reoffending cohort. As we believe that, that 24% might be a slightly inflated figure, and that's on the back of the turnaround reporting that we've been doing recently, which I know isn't purely diversion, but of the 145 children that have completed interventions on turnaround, we've only had 8, so 5-ish% that are in that sort of reoffending category of having a youth caution upwards, and then sort of 9, so a similar amount, have either got a further community resolution / prevention referral, or their offence sort of predated the referral and their sort of involvement with us. So we're hoping to do a piece of work where we can actually split that up for our diversion cohort as well, just to look, because actually, we think those numbers will look more positive and will probably be a similar split to what we've got with turnaround. So thanks, Hannah.
So I'll quickly mention on the data, we count that as children that come back into our service for the diversion children. So it's whether they've had a further sort of outcome that's led to them coming back into our service. Okay, let me just, go for it.
Thanks, Hannah. Trying to just mute again. Thank you. So I suppose to touch on the fact that obviously when we were setting up the service, we wanted it to be evidence-based, but actually, as Hannah said, we're a learning service, so we wanted for our service to be evaluated as well, which was greatly helped by the fact that we were one of the Youth Justice Board's pathfinders for diversion. So as part of that funding from the Youth Justice Board, we actually had our service evaluated by our partners over at the University of Central Lancashire. So over the course of 2 years, I worked with them, and they looked at our service as a whole. And one of the really key parts for us was that research was co-produced. So we had a core group of children that were ultimately co-researchers on this project. So they designed the themes for the interviews with the wider cohort of children. They helped develop the evaluatory measurement tool, the questions that were asked. It was a reflexive process, so we kept going back to them, and they informed the analysis and the findings, and then sort of consulted them at the end with the themes of it. So that was a theme sort of going through, and that also mapped into sort of how we conducted the research. And we didn't necessarily want it to be either quantitative or qualitative. We wanted it to be that mix of the two, and use sort of quite different and creative methodologies. So I've got an example there. As well as sort of your traditional interviews, we did invite children to do walking tours with the researchers so they could take them around their local area, and show them what it was like to be them. We also had anyone that wanted to, they could have drawn a map of their local area and talk the researcher through it from sort of a creative and a drawing perspective, which is the example that you've got there. So it was a really creative and varied methodologies that we used as part of the research. If you pop onto the next slide, Hannah, I've done a very quick summary of the findings because it's sort of a 40-page report, but I've put a link to all of our Pathfinder documents. When we concluded the research, they were uploaded to the Youth Justice Board's resource hub. So I've popped the link on there, so that'll bring up all of the different documents that I produced, including the final report. But in summary, what we found was that children felt listened to and supported by our service, and felt that they'd supported them for things to work. So I've just popped a quote in there, but that actually one outcome of the findings were still, despite that support they've received from the Youth Justice Service, if with true diversion, we want to be light touch and informal, they were still leading very complex lives, and there was lots of intersectional challenges that children faced that could not be overcome by CYJS alone. So linking back to that fact that partnership response is so important. And you've just got an example there of what one child said about the circumstances, and by looking at it, you can see that that's not something that CYJS or any youth justice service can deal with alone. So so the links are all there if you want to read the report, and then you can contact me and ask anything about it. I was the project manager that led on the Pathfinder evaluation, and then I'll hand back over to Hannah.
Thanks, Misha. So just in terms of broadening the conversation around evidence-based practice, really just a really quick sharing of some additional evidence-based work that we're developing linked into some of the diversion work we've done previously. So we're looking at developing a Northwest Youth Justice Services conference with our Pan-Lancashire colleagues, Liverpool and Cumbria. We've just completed some work with Crest Research around our trauma-informed responses, so one of 2 local authorities referenced in that. We're developing an evidence-based suite of resources, which I'll come back to in a minute. We're about to start the NSPCC's harmful behaviour framework audit, so looking at how we provide that sort of continuum of need response to children displaying concerning, inappropriate and harmful sexualised behaviour. So again, that links in with quite a lot of this diversion place. And then Misha's just shared on here some participatory pieces of work that we've been doing with our children, because participation is such a key core component of our Child First diversion and Child First offer across our service. So we've just captured a couple of bits in there. I'm going to move on from those just because of time, if that's all right, Misha. Just to share with you a quote that came from, we were one of only a very small number of services so far that have been chosen as a joint targeted area inspection to serious youth violence. So a whole suite of different inspectors came into Lancashire to look at our partnership responses to serious youth violence. I just pulled out this quote around our youth justice service because I think this sort of, in a nutshell, was kind of like it's been seen in terms of the work that we're doing around diversion prevention. So comprehensive range of evidence-based diversion and preventive services. Children can access a range of activities. There's knife crime programs, mentoring, first aid. These interventions are evaluated to measure impact and are making a positive difference for many children. And that was hugely, that was kind of something we're really proud of, really, that they saw the importance of evidence-based practice to us, but also they saw that that meant that we're making a difference to a large number of children, which was really good for us. Just to share this, the Youth Endowment Fund's toolkit. So when we designed our diversion service, when we looked at some of the evidence, we made sure that we're only looking at the evidence which suggested the most positive approaches to diverting children and supporting children to reduce their risk of serious violence but offending in more general. So we looked at our high impact, moderate impact offer, really, and we've broadened that through our turnaround support. So I'm going to come back to this talk in a second, because some of the developments that we've done through turnaround, which as many of you will know is the Ministry of Justice's prevention and diversion real commitment over the last few years. So additional money is going to services to promote that. We've used a lot of that money to offer a real place-based approach to support. So it fits neatly with our diversion offering that we've been able to really identify an area-based approach to supporting children. It's particularly important for us because of the size of us. So what Burnley needs in the east is going to be different to what Fylde, our coastal area, needs in the west. So there's been a real kind of push around that area-based approach. And what we're going to do in the next few months is what we're currently doing is commissioning the Champions program to do what we're calling a contextual mentoring pilot. So the Champions, as Misha explained, is part of our violence reduction network. It's a mentoring program delivered by Community Football Trust. So we've developed a additional mentoring offer for children in specific areas of Lancashire, but we're also using like a whole family mentoring approach. So whereas previously mentors were for children, we're developing a bit more of a whole family approach to that. So there'll be a mentor for parents as well, who can also work with siblings. So even though those siblings don't necessarily reach turnaround criteria, and the criteria, as many of you all know, is quite structured around those children you can work with on turnaround, our social value of this mentoring pilot and what we put additional money towards is an opportunity to work with those younger children and really get that preventative offering in early doors with siblings of children who are known to services. So we're linking in with our emergency department navigators to do that, and enhancing relationships in communities, families and education settings. And a key part of it is that we're looking at how we support children who are at risk of entering the criminal justice system due to this triangulated link. So children starting to come to attention for ASB in the community. Because of that, they're facing additional places and spaces contextual risks. So we're working really closely with our contextual safeguarding colleagues to identify children and families who may benefit from this. And because of that additional contextual risk, there's then peer relationships that may be characterised by a lack of safety, exploitation risk increases, and carrying weapons may be normalised within that. So we're trying to sort of really get upstream with some of that in the additional work that we're doing at the moment. So that's just a bit of an example of how we've used evidence-based practice to develop our prevention diversion offer. And our next steps linked into that, and that's why I said I'll flip back to the Youth Endowment Fund's toolkit in a second, is that we're commissioning the University of Central Lancashire to develop a toolkit for us around serious violence. So this toolkit will be used with the whole of our cohort of children, but will obviously be really important for our diversion children, that sort of earliest opportunity to try and divert them away from serious violence. So the plan for what we've asked UCLan to do is to do a bit of a survey with our staff of this is what YEF tells us works in terms of reducing the risk of serious violence. Which of these moderate and high impact options of support do you feel confident in delivering? So we're going to be asking our staff, our contextual safeguarding colleagues, our early help colleagues, and we're just having a bit of a working hypothesis that for some of this they may feel more confident around talking about pre-court diversion, because we've done lots of work with that in our service, and sports programs, because again we commission those already, but things like social skills training, cognitive behavioural therapy, they might not have as much experience or confidence in delivering. And from that, we're then going to ask the University of Central Lancashire to develop like a learning and development suite, really. So resources, training, things like that, so that our staff feel more skilled really to deliver some of these higher impact services to our children, because that's what the evidence is telling us reduces the risk of violence. So that's just a bit of an example really of how we use evidence in developing our services. And like I say, there's going to be a key part of making sure that that's accessible for our children at that diversion level as well. So I'll stop sharing so I can see people. That's just a bit of a whistle stop really about how we've developed diversion, how we've tried to implement it, how we try to make sure that we're guided by evidence and that we're measuring outcomes appropriately, and I guess next steps for us as well.
Thank you so much, Hannah and Misha. That was incredible. So thank you so much. We've got about 10 minutes or so for questions. You've had quite a few come in about your presentation, which I'm going to come back to. I'm actually going to go back to an earlier question, which I think related to Claire's comment around avoiding overdosing. So somebody has posted around how long is long for an intervention, which I think is a challenging, but just keen for reflections, and also this point around the importance of understanding the voluntary nature of some of this work. So any reflections from Claire or Kate before we answer some of the questions specific to Lancashire? Thank you.
Yeah, so how long, again, is sort of quite a difficult question, but if we look at it in terms of it being not longer than a statutory outcome, and I'm including there in out-court resolutions, you know, if you get a youth conditional caution, that's, I think it's 3 to 4 months max that you're looking at. Yeah, 3 months. So you want it to be under that if possible, because if not, you're kind of going into the statutory level of intervention, and there isn't a minimum either. I think that's really important. There's not a minimum number of days either. But I also appreciate that some of the children that come through diversion, although we call it low level sort of offences, there can be a lot going on. There's lots of needs and support that needs to be put in place, but it's about you starting that exit planning almost immediately for them out, and if there's other services that can take on that work that isn't youth justice. And it's easier where the youth justice services are embedded in early help, where they're not, and it is youth justice service staff solely delivering diversion. They need to be much more cautious about that. And then quickly on the point of voluntary engagement, so technically it is voluntary, a child can choose to engage or not, as can their families, but you're also hanging a bit of a thing over them, because if they don't engage, if they don't accept diversion, they could end up with a more serious disposal. So is it truly a voluntary intervention? But what we don't want you to do is then, I guess unnecessarily come down too hard on kids who then say yes and then decide not to engage. And that will, again, is why you need really good training about the options that are available in terms of community resolutions or outcome 22, whatever you use, and the steps you can take when children are working with you or not. Because again, there's quite a lot of confusion about the level of responsibility there that professionals have.
No, that's brilliant. Thank you. I was going to say, yeah, definitely. And like you say, the importance of having people communicating clearly what the outcome is, why, what their options are. So yeah, thank you so much. So some of the questions related to the diversion scheme in Lancashire. So are you now using the prevention diversion tool to complete the screening and assessment? So that was the first question.
Good question. It's not quite on our system. We've just had an upgrade today, actually. So hopefully it will be. But yes, absolutely. We'll be doing the new Youth Justice Boards tool for our diversion work, and because we don't want to have lots of different types of assessments around, we'll be using it for all of our children at prevention diversion level. However, the screening, there's not a mandated screening tool, so that will still be a Lancashire model that we'll be using for that.
Fantastic. So really important question, I think. So does the case manager track the young person, or is there someone dedicated to kind of tracking if they, for instance, go to a alternative service?
That's a really good question. So it's a bit of everything, really, to be honest. We've developed a bit of a feedback loop for our services to be able to tell us how our children are doing when they've been diverted out of the service. So there's some data collection that we do through our data analysts, and then there's a team manager that leads on that feedback so that we get that qualitative feedback as well as the quantitative feedback. So it's sort of a bit of a team of people that track those children, but it's a really important part for us because we want to know that they're getting the right service, and that, if for whatever reason the decision that we made hasn't entirely supported them and they still need our help, they can come in under prevention support as well. So we continue to offer that available for those children.
That's great. So another question around kind of the process of the screening. So is the screen completed after discussions with the child and family? And is there a threshold for the offences that are considered? So is the screening completed after discussion with family? And then is there a threshold for the offences that are considered?
Yeah, good question. I saw another one linked in that Charlotte asked, so I'll try and answer that one at the same time. So yes, we try and speak to children and their families as part of that screen discussion, and their views are very much captured within that. So that is part of the process. The question that Charlotte asked linked to that was asking around the young person needs to be screened by different specialists. So the screening information that we get is what's available on systems. So our health lead, for example, will interrogate health systems and give us that. Education manager can give us education information. So we're not going out and speaking to loads of different people. If that child then doesn't come into our service, that's not a child first approach, really, because they're having to tell their story 100 times, or we're going digging, really, where children might not necessarily want us to go digging into sort of some of their personal information with education providers, etc. Then they're not going to work with us. So we get whatever information we can off systems, as well as the voice of the child and the family linked to that. And then the second part of that question that you asked, Steve, just remind me, sorry.
Around whether
the
there's
threshold.
a threshold. Yeah.
Good question. We've been guided to a large extent by the gravity factor matrix. So understandably, we need to use that still as a guide. So there may be some offences where we need more assessment to be able to make that decision. And if we don't think that the police officer can make that single agency decision around outcome, we've got that option for us to then assess and put them into our joint decision making forum, but still with that option of diversion on the table. So there's different pathways that we can follow depending on that. Knife crime comes up a lot. A lot of those do need to go into our joint decision making panel for obvious reasons around needing to assess that wider context for that child, but there are opportunities to divert at lots of different points in the system, really, which is a key part of the development of it.